One last thing before we get started. The next reflection essay, which is the last, is due a week from tomorrow. It's due November 6th, so a week from tomorrow. We turn now in our survey to the 18th century, the 1700s. And we're gradually getting closer to our contemporary period. Certainly, hopefully you've noticed some things as we've taken an examination in other time periods of ways in which things that happened even back in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century have impact on us today. But certainly as we get closer to our time period, we'll see a lot more of those things where you can say, okay, well that's why things exist the way they do today. As we talk about politics, I want to talk a little bit about some things going on in Russia, because that will become important as we get closer to the 20th century. And we haven't really talked about orthodoxy recently. Things, of course, have been going on in orthodoxy. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were several times of reform as well. The difficulty for a lot of Orthodox Christians is that they were living in Muslim-controlled lands. And so their practice was limited to some extent in the sense that there was an impact from the Muslim presence there. But we noted how Orthodoxy, the center of Orthodoxy, had moved to Moscow in the latter parts of those Middle Ages, the early modern period. And so the Patriarchate of Moscow is the only patriarchate as we get into this time period that is not under Muslim control. I want to talk about two main rulers during this 18th century. There are some more, we'll briefly touch on those, but there's two main rulers, both of those known as great rulers in Russian history at this time. First one, of course, that we're talking about is Peter the Great. He was born in 1672 to the imperial family, and 10 years later, he was joint czar, P-S-A-R, or C-Z-A-R, depending on what you look up, with his half-brother in 1682. And the czar, essentially, the word's kind of related to the word Caesar, so it's connected with the idea of emperor, which, of course, there wasn't one in the eastern part of Christianity. And so in Moscow, they had picked up that term to refer to their leaders. But what we begin to see with Peter the Great's reign and others in this time period is that there is more of a separation developing between church and state. The model, that Constantinian model that had been so prevalent in the Eastern Empire of the emperor and the church working together, starts to break apart. During his young adulthood, Peter would often hold drinking parties where he and his friends would make fun of a variety of things, but including those related to the Orthodox Church, communion, the bishops, and even marriage. Right? So there's this kind of, the church isn't something solemn and sacrosanct, but instead something that could be made fun of. His half-brother died in the year 1696, and he also forced his half-sister into becoming a nun, and so he managed to gain total power for himself. But another impact that Peter brings is his desire to make Russia more modern and more Western, which of course brought opposition from many of the bishops in Russia, including the Patriarch of Moscow. And so there's that opposition between church and state. Peter and others in the aristocracy wanted to wear Western European attire, like suits, shave their beards off. They began adopting the Western calendar and year, which on the surface we might say, what's the problem here? Well, for a lot of Russians, holding on to last vestiges of that Eastern European part of Christendom Some of these things were rejections of things that they had worked so hard to maintain against Western Europe, especially those religious things. The Patriarch of Moscow died in 1700, and for the next 20 years or so, Peter enacted a variety of laws that gradually decreased the power of the church. Largely what he's looking at is Europe and how they're developing with Protestantism this state-church concept, where a lot of the heads of state, like in England, had power over the church. And that's what he wants to see in Russia as well. Additionally, he's looking upon these other forms of Christianity and thinking of them as true, but true for the states they're in. So Lutheranism in Germany, Anglicanism for England, and Orthodoxy for Russia. That's what's true for Russians, is Orthodoxy. But Lutheranism is also true for the Germans, Anglicanism for England. In 1701, he will abolish the Moscow Patriarchate and place the church under the control of the emperor.
1701?
Yes, 1701. Several bishops, of course, complain about this, but he removes them from their positions as well. In 1718, a few years after this, a conspiracy develops to release Peter's first wife, who had been forced into a convent, like his sister, his half-sister had been, and have their son, Peter and his first wife's son, crowned as Tsar. Even though Peter had remarried and did not look favorably on this son from his first marriage. So Peter begins this investigation, trying to find out who has been trying to do this. He's using torture against the accused, including his son, who dies in the process. Others, including several of the clergy, are sentenced to death. Peter claims all sorts of religious authority because he has a bishop who is very favorable to him. And so this bishop is essentially writing a theological justification for Peter's actions and his rule in the church. He does eventually establish a council to replace the patriarch, but he requires any of the people on the council to give an oath of allegiance to Peter. He encourages the publication of various documents meant to educate the people on the doctrines of the faith, because he looks at Russia and Russian people and believes that they are becoming too superstitious. He thought they relied too much on rituals like singing, icon veneration, lighting of candles, and they didn't know the basics of the faith. Eventually he will die in 1725. Some of his policies remained, others reverted back to what they were. For the next 40 years, Russia was ruled over by 3 empresses, starting with Peter's second wife. Eventually, however, Catherine, actually Catherine II, eventually known as Catherine the Great, carried out a coup and took the throne. She was German, so there was some resistance from Russians because of thinking of her as a foreigner. She eventually overthrows her husband, Peter III, who was reigning with her, who was the nephew of the previous woman that got overthrown, and they would eventually have him murdered. So Peter the Great and Catherine the Great are much like Herod the Great in that they established their rule through a lot of violence and power. When it comes to Christianity, especially Russian Orthodoxy, Catherine's faith was often a political maneuver rather than personal faith. Feeling that it's really going to connect the people to her if she looks religious, right? Because of how many people in Russia were Orthodox. But privately, she's very influenced by Enlightenment thinking. We'll talk about the Enlightenment here in a little bit. And so she's not very committed religiously. She did encourage freedom of religion in some places. There were others, there were Catholics, there were certainly Protestants as well as Orthodox. There were even Muslims and Jews in Russia at the time. On the other hand, she would confiscate church properties, put them under the control of the state, ultimately making Russia a more secular country, which many point to as causing a spiritual decay in Russian Orthodoxy throughout the rest of the 18th century. Eventually her son would succeed her. He was much more religious, but would even make more grandiose claims than others had. He claimed he was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, for example. Also important politically in the 18th century was the American War of Independence, or the Revolution. The Revolution was largely a political event, but there were a couple of things where religion was tied into some of those things. There were concerns about Catholics being given special provisions in Canada, for example, and so there was a concern that the Crown would do that in England as well. There were a few other things where there were ministers who were speaking for the patriot cause, believing that it was a just cause to overthrow the king, to revolt. But largely the revolution as a political event had more impact on Christianity than Christianity had on encouraging the revolution. And there were a couple of things that are very important in thinking about how this political event shaped religion. One, of course, of the biggest one was the idea of religious freedom. Now, we have talked about how there have been moments in various societies in various times where there has been notions of religious freedom, but with the crafting of the First Amendment, that religious freedom was not only extended to people, it ultimately laid the case for separating religious influence from the state and the state influence from religion. And so even though it's not in the First Amendment, this notion of separation of church and state. Now, the United States has always had a complex relationship between church and state. Church and state have rarely ever truly been separate. A perfect example of this is that the phrase separation of church and state, of course, doesn't appear in the Constitution or the First Amendment, but appears in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to some Baptists in Connecticut. These Baptists in Connecticut were concerned that with the establishment of religion in the states, right? Many of the states kept the state church after the Constitution. In Connecticut, that state church was the Congregationalist church, which was the heirs of the Puritans. And so the Baptists, who are a minority, are concerned that they are going to have that, that's going to affect them because the state church is the Congregationalist church. And so Jefferson responds that within the First Amendment, there has actually been a wall built separating church from state. And gradually, those state churches would be done away with. There are no state churches in our states today. So Jefferson writes this letter talking about this wall between church and state. The next day, Sunday, he goes to a worship service held in the Capitol building. All right? So on one side he says there's this separation of church and state, and then the next day he's present in a service that demonstrates there isn't that separation of church and state. So we've had a complex relationship like that throughout the centuries where there has been this intermingling. Even today, the question of can the United States support a faith-based office within the federal government through which funds are given for faith organizations to do community service type works, offer community service programs. A lot of people would argue that's not separation of church and state. So we have this rather complex relationship. With the separation of church and state, we have the rise of denominationalism. And I said, wait a second, there have been denominations before. We talked about the rise of the Baptists, the Anglicans, Presbyterians were in the reading. Yes, but In many of those cases, we can't talk about them as denominations like what we think about them today, because they were often under a state church. Right? The Baptists were under the Church of England. The Presbyterian Church was the state church in Scotland, but under the Church of England in England. With separation of the church and state and religious freedom, people viewed denominations differently. Many people thinking, well, they're all just separate paths to the same place. Right? Versus the old state church concept where this is a state church and anybody else is operating against it. But also, kind of with that denominationalism is the fact that church attendance, church membership, officially became voluntary. You weren't required to be a member of a church, but that meant, along with disestablishment, right? There's no established state church as we go through the 19th century. That meant that if you wanted to survive as a church, you had to be appealing to people, right? There had to be something about you, your doctrine, your practice, something that made people want to join your church, because otherwise they would go to someplace else. They're not forced to go to this particular religious group by state order. So religion became a voluntary thing. And then finally, for a lot of people, Christianity especially and patriotism were very closely intertwined. To be a good Christian in the United States was to be a patriot. To be a patriot was to be a good Christian. And so this idea of the intertwining of patriotism, and we still see that today among some people. There's a close tie in the minds of many people between patriotism, support of the United States, and Christianity. Certainly a lot more we could say about the war, the Revolutionary War, and the impact it made, and some other ideas, things like, was this a Christian just war? In the just war tradition, is this just? Since it goes against Romans chapter 13, right, where you're supposed to accept authority of government. 1 Peter chapter 2 that says, honor the king. Was the Revolutionary War a just war in the Christian tradition? There's all sorts of things that we could go with that we just don't have time to talk about. But with the War of Independence, there's this introduction of a representative republic, not a true democracy, but a representative republic where the people have a voice in government. Well, something similar happened over in France as well. But while the American War of Independence allowed religion to flourish, the French Revolution often stood against religion. In the latter part of the 18th century, economic conditions deteriorated in France, which led to a lot of social tensions between the clergy and the nobility, between nobility and commoners, commoners and clergy. And throughout all of this, there were several times where the people of Paris rioted to show their opposition. During all this time, the National Constituent Assembly, which was essentially kind of the coming out of the French Parliament, issued a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Essentially, this idea was, or some of the things said out of this, was important emphasis placed on freedom, equal rights, including the idea that liberty, and this is a quote, liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. Right? So you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't injure somebody else or deprive them of their rights. No one shall be disquieted, again quoting, on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. Every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. Well, the French king refuses to accept this, and so the Paris populace riots again. Eventually, the civil constitution of the clergy is promulgated, also by the National Constituent Assembly. And if you remember back, we briefly mentioned at other times that France had received some freedoms from Rome that the Pope had not given in other countries, largely due to the need to rely on France and throughout the Avignon papacy. And so in the civil constitution, the National Constituent Assembly decides that the bishops need to be regulated. Quote, "No church or parish of France, nor any French citizen, may acknowledge upon any occasion or upon any pretext whatsoever the authority of an ordinary bishop or of an archbishop whose see," the region they're under control of, that they're over of, "shall be under the supremacy of a foreign power," which of course the Pope was, "nor that of his representatives residing in France or elsewhere." But there is that exception for the visible head of the universal church. To continue quoting, "Beginning with the day of publication of the present decree, there shall be but one mode of choosing bishops and parish priests, namely that of election." All right, so they're taking the right of the Pope, the archbishops, to appoint bishops in France and saying they're going to be elected. The people are going to decide. Paul VI condemns the document because it's essentially trying to cut his power and the power of the bishops. But Louis XVI, who was king at the time, finds out that he's condemned it, but he wants to keep that secret from the people, because if the people find out the Pope is condemned, there's going to be a riot. Ultimately, he agreed with the Assembly, the Civil Constitution, with the proviso that the Pope supported. All clergy were expected to agree to it or be removed. Eventually, war would erupt between France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Austria and Prussia especially. France was on the losing end. And so civil war develops in France. The monarchy is abolished, the king is convicted of treason and executed. Rebellion, revolution, and terror flowered. Enemies of the revolution faced the guillotine in the so-called Reign of Terror. Many of the revolutionaries in this war were very anti-religious and believed themselves the epitome of thinkers of science and reason, but they still recognized the need for some sort of organization that would tie people together. And so the cult of reason was developed. Essentially, the civic response to an anti-religious outlook. The cult of reason would be a social organization that served the function of religion, but, those ideas of community, but attempting to avoid what they considered the superstitious aspect of religion, deities, supernatural revelation. Ultimately, the cult of reason, supposedly being reasonable, would lead to persecution, imprisonment, and death, as priests and nuns would refuse to swear before the altar of freedom, various altars to the goddess freedom. After the reign of terror had died down, ultimately out of all of this, Napoleon Bonaparte came to power. He attempted to reconcile France to the papacy, particularly after the death of Pius VI, who had been captured by the French. He would release the Concordat of 1801, which gave the church back some of its civil status. Catholicism would be noted as the religion of the majority of French people, but it was not the state religion any longer. The church would be allowed to remove bishops from power, but it was the French state that would nominate them. A couple quotations here. Before assuming their functions, the bishops will take directly at the hands of the first consul the oath of loyalty used before the change of government. First consul referred to Napoleon's position at the time. The oath of loyalty expressed in the following terms. I swear and promise before God, on the Holy Scriptures, to observe obedience and loyalty to the government established by the Constitution of the French Republic. I also promise to have no dealings, to attend no council, to converse with no group, whether within or without, which would be contrary to the public peace. And if, in my diocese or elsewhere, I learn that something is being plotted to the detriment of the state, I will make it known to the government. And so they essentially are making priests and bishops spies for the government, making them swear an oath of allegiance. A prayer, again quoting, a prayer in the following form will be repeated at the end of the divine office referring to the Mass and some other religious observances, will be repeated at the end of divine office in all Catholic churches in France. God save the Republic, God save the consuls. Eventually, Napoleon would maneuver his way into becoming emperor. Pius VII will come to his coronation, but just as he is preparing to put the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon will turn, take the crown from him, and put the crown on his own head instead of allowing the Pope to do it. Questions about any of the things that we've talked about with respect to politics? We turn now to some cultural and social developments. Again, a lot more that we could say here. But one of the major philosophical movements of the 18th century is often called the Enlightenment. It's a little deceptive by referring to the Enlightenment because there were actually enlightenments. And there were different ways people approached this notion of reason, and reason being an authority in philosophy. And so, in one sense, to refer to it in the singular is misleading. But in a sense, there are some general strands that tie these enlightenments together. Ultimately, this is coming out of a lot of the scientific and philosophical developments of the 17th century, which emphasized empiricism, observation, knowledge coming through the senses, as well as a mechanistic view of the universe. Right? That the universe, the solar system, operated according to certain laws that were in place. Right? The Earth revolves around the sun at the same speed. That the stars and all those kind of things, all of that operates under certain laws of motion. Meaning that there was less of concern to say there needs to be something supernatural to uphold all of this. The Enlightenment, of course, touched on things other than philosophy. It had consequences in criminal punishment, economics, politics, but it had, of course, consequences in religion as well, specifically for Christianity, but also for Judaism in Europe at the time. There were a couple of themes that come out of the Enlightenment that had some important bearing on Christianity. First was the idea that the universe is rational. And the best way to understand the universe and how the universe works is through the reason. Now, you might think, okay, I kind of agree with that, but what the Enlightenment thinkers were saying at the time was in contrast to revelation. Right? That we understand the universe best through what God has revealed in the Bible. And so they're saying the best way is to understand through the reason. Here we have things that are kind of culminating that have been developing since the scholasticism of the 12th and 13th centuries. Okay? This emphasis on reason and religion. A second theme was the emphasis on truth truth coming through empirical observation. How do you know the truth about nature? How do you know the truth about human beings? Well, you observe. You take in information through your senses. Through your eyes, through your ears, through the other senses as well. Also important for the idea of understanding was human experience. It is human experience that helps us understand, not some sort of authority that stands outside of human experience. A final theme was the importance of progress. History is about progress, moving forward. So, the present age is more enlightened than the past. But the Enlightenment thinkers, many of them, were not interested in getting rid of religion altogether. Some became irreligious, but many of them felt that there were aspects from these themes, from others, that they could develop that could still hold on to religion, believing that they had discovered these things through abstract reasoning, not through cultural teachings, what they grew up in, what the church taught. One of the first beliefs that many Enlightenment thinkers had religiously was that there was a creator God. For many, that notion of design existing in the universe meant that there was a designer. And by the fact of the universe operating in mechanistic ways, suggested design to a lot of those Enlightenment thinkers. Many of them also believed in the afterlife, which might be a difficult one to say, how do you get to that from abstract reasoning, right? You're only doing reasoning. You're not appealing to a scripture. You're not appealing to some sort of revelation. Well, for many, it was based on, or at least they claimed, it was based on the cyclical aspects of nature, right? Nature is born, spring, you go through fall, winter, and then is reborn in spring. So this notion that life begets life, death, new life, suggested that there was something afterward. Certainly that's a difficult one if you're only going by reason. The notion that something exists after death, it's hard to see that one compared to a creator God. Right? Reasonably, yes, it makes sense how you get to the notion of creator, but the afterlife, and many of them also believed in, those that held to an afterlife, believed in rewards and punishments in that afterlife. A third common belief for many Enlightenment thinkers was in the moral teachings of Jesus. Many of them rejected Jesus' divinity. Jesus wasn't God in human form in the Enlightenment, but he was a good moral teacher. An extreme like this might be something we see with somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who took the New Testament and the Gospels and redacted out of the Gospels anything that smacked of the supernatural, leaving him only with the teachings of Jesus, believing that he was getting back to who Jesus really was, and then he would publish that as the life and philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. So out go the miracles, out go the virgin birth, out goes the resurrection. The Enlightenment had consequences, of course, rejection of authorities, both religious and otherwise, an emphasis on toleration, and a turn to the natural world. One religious group kind of coming out of the Enlightenment was deism. Sometimes deists were also referred to as freethinkers. That was the one that they preferred. Other people referred to them as deists. Essentially, the deist view, if you really want to boil it down to something, was the belief in the clockmaker God. That God acted like a clockmaker who had built the universe, wound it up, stuck it on the mantle over the fireplace, and then backed away from it and let it run. God wasn't involved in the universe. He had created it, but wasn't actively involved. The universe was given over to natural processes. Many of the freethinkers, deists, were concerned with the amount of division that was present in religion by this time. Right? We're talking now a century and a half of religious division, religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, between Protestants. And so that was something they were concerned about. How do we bring unity to religion and cease this violence? Well, that unity would come, they thought, through through reason, not appeals to revelation. Because they're looking at a situation and they're saying, well, all these people are appealing to the Bible, but they're claiming different interpretations. If we act reasonably, if we think through reason, we can all come to the same conclusion. It was thought. Furthermore, they believed that what was important within Christianity were the essentials. Find those things that are essential in religion. Everybody can agree on the essentials, and then everybody can just let everybody else go with things that were not essential. We're going to agree on the essentials, and then, if you want to hold some other belief, that's okay. But acting through the reason, we are not going to persecute people because of that. So what were those essentials? First was the belief that God existed and should be worshipped. Again, they believed that reason taught them that. But for the deists, worship was enacted when you lived a good life, when you were a moral person, when you were virtuous. That's what worship was.
Practice of virtue, true worship is considered an essential?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So when they say worship, what they meant was living morally, right? Being a virtuous person. Another essential that they supported was the idea of the need for change. Right? If you're not virtuous, then you need to become virtuous. And then finally, a belief that there is a time coming where, after life, you will either be rewarded or punished based on how you acted. So one aspect of the Enlightenment ended in things like deism, other kind of rejections of revealed religion. On the other hand, we had other philosophical developments that attempted to rehabilitate religion in the context of supporting Christianity. One of those is what's known as Scottish common sense, sometimes referred to as common sense realism, sometimes also referred to as the Scottish philosophy. Right? And so the Scottish Enlightenment, the Enlightenment in Scotland, led not to this skepticism, but to an attempt to say there are some things we can know religiously. It was started by a couple of thinkers, including Thomas Reid and Dugald Stewart, who were philosophers, university philosophers in the 18th century. Very important as well for other ministers and philosophers, including John Witherspoon, Presbyterian minister, the only minister who signed the Declaration of Independence. Largely what the Scottish common sense thinkers did was took the method of Francis Bacon in the context of science that we talked about before the exam. This idea of inductively reasoning. If you want to know the truth about something, you look at the facts, and out of those facts you make the, inductive general principles. And so they took that and said, all right, Bacon was using it to make scientific discoveries, but let's apply that to reality and thinking about reality, what's true. And effectively arguing that there is an obviousness that that nature is rational. Right? There's the notion here of common sense, that everybody can know that nature is real. So in response to a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who were trying to be skeptical, right? How can we truly know what's real? Well, we intuitively know, automatically, that we're real, that the things we encounter through our senses are real, this podium exists because I can touch it, I can see it. Very important, of course, as we have already mentioned, the idea of observed data, importance of facts. And then, as we mentioned, that obviousness, the ordinary experience. I don't have to wonder if you exist. I see you there existing. But it's not just the reality of ourselves and the reality of objects that this would help, but the principles of morality and religious beliefs that seem to be obvious. Right? These two were helped along by Scottish common sense. And Scottish common sense would become very important for a lot of Protestant thinkers in the United States and how they approach the Bible. So that's largely the 19th century, and so we'll hold off to that. In the 17th century, we put slavery in politics. This time I've decided to stick it in culture and society, but as with other aspects, it goes past many of these categories. We talked about a couple of things when we were in the 17th century. That what we have there is the start of the slave trade, and how as the slave trade started, it is bringing Africa, Europe, the Americas interconnected with each other. And that there is this encounter between African traditional religions, Islam, which was present quite a bit in Africa, as well as Christianity. But in the 17th century, there wasn't a very strong concern about missionizing, evangelizing slaves. So we have this complex encounter, but as slavery becomes more a part of the colonies, right? We're talking the period before the Revolution here. As these cash crops are developing, right? Tobacco, indigo, rice. Toward the end of the 18th century, with the development of the cotton gin, then cotton will become a cash crop as well. You know, these large labor forces, people choosing slavery instead of hiring workers. And that's part of the reason why slavery dies off in the North. It wasn't that the North was somehow less racist than the South. It was there were no cash crops in the South like there was in the North like there was in the South. Eventually, though, throughout the 18th century, there were several attempts by Christians to try and evangelize slaves. In the early 1700s, the Anglicans, the Church of England, started the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which was an attempt to evangelize the world, but also in the Americas focused on bringing the message to slaves. But a problem arises. What happens once these slaves are baptized? Because a lot of people are concerned that baptism would then require owners to set them free. Eventually it was decided that baptizing slaves did not change their social status. They were still slaves. And in fact, laws were passed in the early part of the 18th century to claim just that. In fact, some ministers would require that baptism would require slaves to agree that baptism did not set them free before they would baptize them. The continual emphasis throughout this time period was on those passages of Scripture that proclaim, "Servants, obey your masters." Anglicans, however, largely did not have a whole lot of success with evangelizing slaves, especially slaves born in Africa. Usually, many people will say, you know, one component of this barrier to conversion was the hypocrisy of white Christians who would try to proclaim the Christian gospel, but then lived elsewhere, or lived in different ways toward them throughout the week. As I mentioned, many of the sermons focused on issues like slaves, obey your masters, don't steal, don't lie, right? A lot of things that would have supported the slave system. While Anglicans weren't successful, in the latter part, or the middle part of the 18th century, some evangelicals were successful. We'll talk more about evangelicalism in a little bit, but part of the reason why evangelicals, which would include groups like Baptists, eventually Methodists, even pure Presbyterians, many of them were successful in the South, in the early period with African slaves, largely because they were willing to license black preachers. They were willing to establish congregations where a black preacher could preach. The Anglicans, however, would not. And so that was one reason, perhaps, that the slaves would be more welcoming of evangelicals. Also, evangelicals in this time period were much more egalitarian, much more about the equality. By the 19th century, however, those very same evangelicals, or their spiritual heirs, were the people arguing for the slave state. Were arguing for the continuance of slavery. All right, so between the 18th and 19th century, there's quite a turn. Some slaves welcomed the instruction given by Christian ministers for a couple of reasons. First, it would get them out of work. And so for some time period, instead of being forced out into the fields, you'd be able to sit and listen to somebody teaching. Even though you may not agree with it, you might not be willing to accept it, for some, it was a way to escape work. For others, it made them feel superior. Because as they accepted Christianity, they could then judge their masters because they felt that they were practicing Christianity better than their masters were. Right? And so you're practicing the white man's religion better than the white man did. Right? And so some welcomed instruction because of that. Others, especially towards the 19th century, used it as a means of rebellion. Right? The concepts of the gospel, freedom, equality, those kinds of things within the gospel message, would gradually would culminate in a variety of slave revolts and rebellions. There were some free blacks in the North that would eventually start their own denominations, usually many of them from within a parent denomination, like the work of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Richard Allen was born a slave in Philadelphia. His master was a lawyer and then later Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He would later be sold along with his family to a planter in Delaware. And then his mother and siblings would later be sold again, separating the family. During this time, he converted to Methodism, became active in spreading the message to his remaining siblings that were still with him and to others. He became determined that being Christians, and a lot of slavery supporters thought this, that slaves being Christian would make them better slaves. Eventually his master would allow Richard to bring in preachers, one of whom would actually convince Richard Allen's master that slavery was wrong. And so he would allow Richard Allen to purchase his freedom. He encouraged him to work for revolutionary forces and gain enough money to be free. He said, why didn't he just free him? Well, there were laws in place that did not allow those kind of things in southern states where you could just free your slave. Right? There had to be some sort of purchase. And so his master, even though he's convicted that slavery is wrong, the law says you can't just free your slaves. Eventually, Richard would take the last name Allen. He would start preaching, traveling, preaching to whites and blacks, starts the Free African Society with Absalom Jones, as a means for blacks to help each other out economically. Allen and Jones would continue preaching and gain quite a few converts, eventually becoming members of St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, a place where there were a lot of tensions between blacks and whites. In November of 1787, white trustees would force blacks in the assembly from the front rows of the gallery to the seats further back. The black church members would then say, we're just leaving. And so they exited altogether. Starting out what they would call the African Church, later renaming it the Bethel African Church. But there ends up being a disagreement between Jones and Allen over which denomination should we associate with. Because essentially Methodism is still within Anglicanism at this time. It's still within the Church of England. So do we associate with this developing Methodist denomination, or do we associate with this developing Episcopal denomination in this post-revolutionary period? Allen and some others want to be Methodists. Jones and others want to be Episcopalians. Jones will eventually become the first African-American Episcopal priest. Race tensions, however, will eventually push Allen and the Bethel Church out of the Methodist fold, and he will start the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church. Questions about the Enlightenment or slavery, any of the things we've talked about? Let's turn then to talking about doctrinal developments. As we've already kind of hinted at with the Enlightenment, and as we've pointed to in previous lectures, the development of science was leading to discoveries that people were beginning to say, we don't need the church to help us understand this. Right? And so this split developing between science and religion. The development of natural theology was an attempt to try and address this split between science and religion, arguing that the natural world indicated the existence of God. Now, natural theology, in a sense, had been around for centuries. And there was even evidence of this approach back in Greek philosophy. Certainly not Christian in its Greek form. But essentially the idea that God's existence could be determined from nature and not just revelation. Essentially there was the idea that God had two books. There was the book of Revelation, the Bible, and the book of nature. One of the first major natural theologians in the 18th century, perhaps the one that makes the most impact, was William Paley. Paley was born in England in 1743 and would eventually become a lecturer at Christ's College at Cambridge. And a lot of his focus was on lecturing on moral philosophy, people like Locke and some of the others from previous generations. He's ordained an Anglican priest in 1767 and would go on to write a variety of textbooks, mostly on philosophy. But he would write several apologetic works on Christian evidences. There are a couple of areas where Paley is important. First is his presentation of what is known as the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Paley compares life to a watch found in the forest. Coming upon such an object, we would assume that there was a watchmaker, a creator behind it. Now, there has been a similar argument for the existence of God around for a long time. We've seen it back as far as scholasticism. But Paley's is the one that catches on with a lot of Anglo-Protestants, especially in the United States. Paley's also important because he develops a couple of arguments that are meant to be evidences of the truthfulness of Christianity, based on a couple of things, two major ones: the suffering of the apostles and early Christians. Why would they be willing to suffer and be persecuted for something they did not believe to be true? And then secondly, arguing that the miracles of the New Testament were much more trustworthy than other ancient miracle stories in other religions because they were better attested. Certainly, several of these arguments and others were very useful for Christians, helped strengthen their faith. But they certainly didn't persuade many people who were and are antagonistic to traditional Christianity. Also important doctrinally in the 18th century is the writing and thinking of Jonathan Edwards. He has been referred to as America's greatest theologian. Part of that has to do with just the amount of how much material has been left by Edwards. Yale University has put out the works of Jonathan Edwards. It's 26 volumes and consists of essentially Edwards left 100,000 handwritten pages that have been now typeset and put into print. Right? So for how prolific he was, certainly that. But also he has a very important impact on especially Calvinist forms of American Christianity. He was born in 1703 in Connecticut to a minister and his wife. And very on in his life, his father is preparing for Jonathan to be a minister as well. His father ran a school to prepare boys for college, and so Jonathan learned early in his life classical and biblical languages, philosophy, science, and church history. In 1716, he would enter what would eventually become Yale. It's not named Yale at the time that he enters it. He would graduate as valedictorian of his class in 1720 and would begin graduate studies to become a minister. He becomes interested in the writings of Isaac Newton, John Locke, and other philosophers and scientists. While still a student, he begins preaching for a Presbyterian church in New York City. Most of his sermons were, as some people have put it, warm, earnest, and optimistic, emphasizing the beauty of God and the godly love. Edwards finished his degree in 1723 and begins preaching in a variety of places over the next several years. He would work as a tutor for a while at Yale College, but eventually moves to Massachusetts to help his grandfather with ministerial duties. His grandfather would die in 1729, leaving Jonathan Edwards the sole minister. He is very concerned that a lot of New England theology is becoming Arminian. Right? The notion that there isn't predestination of individuals. The notion that that people have some freedom in choosing with their salvation. And so he focused a lot on his preaching on what God's grace does to a person's soul, emphasizing the importance of God's work rather than human work. In the mid-1730s, his congregation begins experiencing a great revival. There's lots of emotionalism, lots of people committing to Christianity, joining the church as members. And he publishes a work called A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God, about what's going on. The work does very well, makes Edwards well known, even known internationally, as the book is sold overseas, and people look to him as a model of evangelism. Right? This is working, so let's do what Edwards has done. However, by the late 1730s, he starts to experience tensions with the church he is ministering to. The church had built a new building and gave preferred seating to the wealthy people in the town. And Edwards doesn't like this practice, and he makes it known. Furthermore, people that had converted in the mid-1730s didn't seem to be evidencing godly behavior or even that in-depth, constant concern for religion. And so he becomes convinced that those conversions in the middle of the 1730s were false. But he would continue to try and bring back the revival. In the 1740s, he would see it again. Edwards would try to feed off of this fervor, and in the midst of it, preaches his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he talked about the flames of the wrath of God, that essentially human beings have nothing to stand on. We are going to fall into the pit. God despises sinners. He holds them over the pit of hell, much like one would hold a spider or some loathsome insect. Very terrible description of how the sinner stands before God. And Edwards' church doesn't really respond that much to the sermon. But when he preaches it in a nearby town, the people moan and shriek and weep, crying out for their salvation for fears of going to hell. This in the face of the fact that Edwards himself, as a minister, was evidently very monotone. There wasn't very much emotionalism in his presentation either. And so it's just from the words themselves that are causing this reaction. Edwards continues to write and preach in support of the revivals, but there is growing opposition because of the emotionalism. So in 1746, he writes a treatise concerning religious affection. Religion, says Edwards, consists in holy affections or emotions. But there was the need for individuals to make a distinction between what constituted true religious emotions and were not religious emotions. Just because you felt like it was love, or there was an effect on your body, didn't mean that it was a true religious affection. True affections resulted in a change of nature. True affections had a result in Christian practice. You could see that somebody had been changed. Edwards' reputation also continues to spread internationally. He tries to keep up with international developments and news and works them into his sermons, but tensions continue with his congregation. He preaches against immorality among the people, condemns some things that are going on in the town. Ultimately, the church demands that Edwards give an account of how he is spending the funds he receives from the church as a salary. He was dismissed. He was fired in 1750. In his last sermon, he preaches about the day of judgment and how both minister and congregation will have to appear before Christ and give an account of what has happened there in Northampton, Massachusetts, with Edwards claiming he is going to be vindicated. Wouldn't you like to preach that as your last sermon in the church? You're going to have to stand before God for what you've done to me. He would end up preaching for a small congregation, evangelizing Native Americans. Eventually he was asked to become president of the College of New Jersey, which would eventually become Princeton. As he arrived there, there's a smallpox outbreak. Edwards took the smallpox inoculation, but it was infected, and he died in 1758 after several weeks of illness. His impact, however, probably can't be overstated. Not only among Calvinists, Calvinist theologians, even up till today. I mean, very prominent preacher Rick Warren names Edwards as his favorite theologian. A couple of years ago, there was this revival of interest in Reformed theology and a picture on Christianity Today. The T-shirt with Jonathan Edwards on that said, "Jonathan Edwards is my homeboy." All right, so he's had a much broader effect on American Christianity. Let's turn to a couple of ways of changes in the development of Christian practice. First, I want to talk about the development of Methodism. Methodism was started by John and his brother Charles Wesley. They were raised in a religious family of 19 kids. Only 11 of those survived. Charles was 4 years younger than John. They'd almost died in a fire when John was 6. Samuel and Susanna Wesley, the father and mother, were very, very Anglican, very focused on the church. But both of their fathers, both Samuel's father and Susanna's father, had been kicked out of the Anglican ministry. They raised their children in the church. Samuel was a priest, but he was also a poet. John would go on to study at Oxford, along with Charles, and they participated in a group that met to focus on study and worship. They practiced weekly communion. They encouraged each other to visit people in prison. They spent a lot of time together fellowshipping. The group was pejoratively called the Holy Club or Methodists because they had this method that they were following. It included a member named George Whitefield. We'll come back to Whitefield. John would eventually become an Anglican priest. He is traveling to the American colonies on a mission trip, and while on the trip, a storm comes up, and Wesley is terrified of what's going to happen with the storm. And he happens to look over and see a group of Moravians who were Christians from Eastern Europe, pietists, people that were very focused on an emotional connection to God. And here they are in this storm, and they're not scared, they're not terrified, they're at peace. And one of these guys, who were we talking about? John Wesley. Wesley becomes very concerned because he doesn't have that faith. Right? He doesn't have that conviction that no matter what happens, God is going to get me through, so I don't need to fear. And so he becomes very concerned about his salvation. While reading Luther's work on the Epistle to the Romans, he begins to feel, as he's put it, his heart strangely warmed, and becomes convinced that now he has achieved salvation. He would go to travel to Germany and meet the leader of the Moravians, but would eventually come back to England, where he would study with other English reformers. He becomes convinced that the Anglican Church needs to have reform, but Wesley will always stay within the Anglican Church. He never breaks away from Anglicanism. Eventually, he will become Arminian in his theology, especially when it came to the issue of salvation. He still believed salvation was by grace through faith, but believed that it was open to everybody. And he also believed that human beings could lose their salvation. They could fall from grace. Wesley would start preaching about this revival that he was experiencing, and he would gain followers. He would divide them into smaller groups that he would call societies, and then divide them into smaller groups known as classes, encouraging them to meet weekly, to read, to study, to pray. He would travel frequently to encourage these Methodists. Some people estimate he traveled 200,000 miles during his ministry. However, in these Methodist classes, most of the leadership were from the lower classes and used preachers who were not ordained in the Church of England. And so a lot of the upper class Anglicans start to break away from Methodists. They don't want to follow what Wesley's teaching because they got these lower class leaders. They are democratic regarding leadership. Essentially, Wesley saw this as a parallel structure to the Church of England, right? It's within the Church of England, but it's meant to encourage the faith of people. But breaks eventually happen, with it developing into a separate denomination toward the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. Wesley also emphasized the idea of Christian perfection. Human beings, he believed, could become sinless through a second blessing of the Holy Spirit. But the second blessing only occurred after salvation. Right? So it wasn't possible for you to be sinless before salvation. When you received the first blessing of the Holy Spirit, you were saved, but the second blessing, said Wesley, could bring salvation. Later in his life, Wesley would condemn the American Revolution, thinking that it was usurping, revolting against a godly ordained leader. But when many of the Anglican priests left the colonies, and the Anglican leadership refused to send more, he would set up Methodist leaders in the United States to perform the sacraments. While John became known for his preaching, his sermons, his writing, Charles became known for his work with hymns. Charles was the author or translator of 4,000 hymns, many of which are still used very prominently. Hymns like A Charge to Keep I Have, and Can It Be That I Should Gain, Hark, the Herald Angels Sing, and Soldiers of Christ Arise. The brothers would die within 3 years of each other in the 1780s. And at that point, the church had over 70,000 members and was close to becoming an independent church. There's a couple other things I want to talk about with 18th century practice of evangelicalism, and then talk about some other famous hymn writers of the time. We don't have the time to get into that now, so we'll pick that up on Tuesday when we will also go into the 19th century.